Good evening, everyone. It's a little bit late this evening, not unusual for these little videos that I do. Um, I delayed one day for this just to make sure that I got more of your responses, and we're going to go to this different strategy of putting us stuff up on Friday, which was my original intention, and actually asking you to post by Tuesday the latest, at least your first post, and I really would like you to post something at least on all the questions that are being asked. So let's get right to this past week, lesson 3, which deals with Genesis 12 to 50, what's called the patriarchal narratives, these beginnings of sort of what appears to be kind of historical, at least it's in the world of history. The chapters 1 to 12 are called the prehistorical chapters because they really find themselves in what is called prehistory, kind of a mythic fable, people living to extraordinarily long lives, and so on and so forth. Now we enter into the world of regular people living regular lives with their children and the story of the family relationships and all of those kinds of things. So I asked you in the first couple of questions that in the discussion threads to reflect on history and ideology and thinking about the patriarchs in general. I think that the questions you responded very questions. To those two questions. And my only comments go back to things that I had written in my comments there. Questions of the historicity of what happened. Do we know that there was an Abraham who did this, that, and the other? Was there an Isaac who was almost sacrificed by his father, and so on? We'll never know those kinds of questions. They're not sort of national questions where you can think of things differently when there is a country, a nation called Israel, and they have kings and so on. This is of a different sort. And McCarter writes about ideology, and that what we have here is a lot more ideology. Mark Bretler writes about this as well. And one of the questions is, what is the ideology here? We won't deal with that at this point, but we'll never know, as I said, what actually happened. This needs to be read, I think, more in the context of something that I would call a sacred story. I used to call this myth, but people didn't like that word, so I'll just go back to sacred story. So these stories are sacred stories. What that means is that they're passed down from generation to generation, and every generation usually adds something of its own to the story. What the origin of the story is hard to figure out. But maybe there were people called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and maybe there were families involved here in all of this, but we can't really know that for sure. We do have a certain sense that the historical background that's alluded to here seems to reflect some ancient Near Eastern cultures, ancient Near Eastern practices. There's been controversy, for instance, over the wife-sister relationship that exists between Abraham and Sarah, Jacob and Rebekah, where that comes from, how. There's been a lot of controversy about where that happened, but people will look to the ancient Near East and see, how did that occur? The other thing that McCarter, again, wants for us to do is to say, well, how old are these stories? What kinds of ancient practices do we find in there which can go way back? And then are there more recent practices? Do these go back in to ancient Near East, to Babylonia, to Egypt? And there's evidence that there's not so much Babylonia, but Egyptian, Mesopotamian kind of background to a number of these stories we learn from the place names, from the person names, and so on. Now, the other question is, what are the themes that here? What is the ideology that you actually find in these stories? The ideology that has to do with the original founders, the parents, the ancestors of who the Israelite people will be later, and what kinds of trials and tribulations they had, how the family dynamics work, the testing that occurs with Abraham and Isaac, the internecine strife between the brothers, Jacob and Esau, and Isaac and Ishmael. All of these are common themes which you see in ancient Near Eastern stories. So as we think about this particular section of the Bible, it's very hard to understand what are the moral lessons that we're supposed to learn here. Many of you talked about the moral lessons in these stories. I have to admit that for many of these stories, I don't know what the moral lesson is. Even in the story of the binding of Isaac, what's the point of the story? That God didn't kill Isaac, or that Abraham didn't kill Isaac, or slaughter him, or that he was ready to kill Isaac and God stopped him at the last minute. What do we learn from the story of Jacob fooling his father Isaac? What kind of morality stuff is there? There's a lot of things that happen here that are obviously more interesting. It's not so black and white, but I don't think it's so easy to pull what we would consider moral lessons out of all of these stories. If we go on to the Auerbach essay, Erich Auerbach and the Akedah, as you can see from my postings, I'm a big fan of Auerbach and of this essay. Some of you were not such big fans of this essay. I'm a big fan because for me, he shined a bright light on the distinctive character of biblical literature. And in the contrast with Greek literature, Homer makes it easy to zero in on the particularities of the Bible. As he says, the Bible is fraught with background. In Homer, everything is in the foreground. The reason for the title Odysseus' Scar is because that's something that Homer would write about the Bible. You don't know about anybody's scars. You don't know what they look like. You don't know how big they were. You don't know what color hair they had. You don't know what kinds of houses they lived in. You don't know all kinds of things like that, because everything is in the background. It's not an issue of the Bible being better or worse than Homer. It's a different style. It's up to us to take notice of this and to understand the results and the implications. And we talked a little bit about this, and I did in the responses in the discussion thread. But you will see that this kind of literature, which he calls evocative literature, it evokes a response in us. We like to fill in the details. We like to have a sense of what did Abraham look like? What was the relationship with Isaac as he was walking with him? What was going on even in the Cain and Abel story, as one of you wrote? What is the relationship between Cain and Abel, and what's the relationship with the parents? We're not given a lot of information there. And one of the implications of these is that every generation reads it and asks its questions. Those things that are burning questions for the particular generation are raised with regard to the Bible. So the Bible becomes a vehicle for each generation to sort of think about those things that are of importance to it. And we're going to be reading Midrash a little later, which we'll see in the first few centuries did exactly that. Finally, the literary analysis of a section of Genesis that I asked you to do. I think you did some very interesting work on this. And I would say that a close reading of the texts will yield lots of questions, but also give us some clues as to answers. This kind of close reading also encourages us to ask the questions of the text which are uniquely ours and in some ways belong to our age. But also many of the questions we ask of the text has been asked many times over the years. And the study of biblical commentaries and exegesis over time shows that there are continuities between our religious and literary sensibilities and those of the rabbis in the first centuries and those of the commentators in the Middle Ages. So we both have an opportunity to look at continuities and at differences as we think about questions that we might ask. So, for instance, when we look at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the medieval commentators ask totally different questions than we would ask today. Nobody says, how could God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son. It's immoral. It's wrong. This son who he had, that Abraham had after all of these years that he loved so dearly, how could God do that? They ask an entirely different question, which is God said, go and sacrifice your son. Then he changes his mind later on. He says, don't sacrifice your son. How could God do that? Can you ever believe anything God's going to say to you if one moment he says X and the other moment he says Y? So, and they have an answer to that. It doesn't say sacrifice him. At the beginning it says ha'aleu sham le'olah, raise him up there as a sacrifice, but doesn't really say to sacrifice, so it doesn't really change his mind that much later on. That's a kind of maneuvering to get around that question. So that's it for this second lesson. And for the next few days until Friday, we'll be spending time focusing on the Exodus and the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. By the way, how do you count those 10 commandments? How are they divided into 10 as you look at Exodus 20:21? And where is the number 10 mentioned? Something to think about as you're reading this material. So enjoy it, and I'll have another one of these videos, I think Thursday night, hopefully. Good night.